In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a custom block that compares two numbers in a list that are next to each other and then moves along the list comparing each of the pairs of numbers that are side by side. Here's an example. Let's say you want to make a custom block that could figure out whether all of the numbers in a list were doubling. One way you would do that is you could start with the first two numbers and check if the second one is twice as big as the one before it. And if that's true, 2 is twice as big as 1, then you could go on to the third number and see if it's twice as big as the one before it. 4 is twice as big as 2, so I can go move on to the fourth one. And then 8 is twice as big as 4, then move on to the fifth item in the list and make sure it's double the one before it. It is. Move on to the sixth item of the list and make sure it's double the one before it, and it is. And if you get to the end of the list and all of the numbers were double the one before them, then you know that this list is doubling the whole way up. Notice how I didn't check to see if 1 was double the thing before it, because there is nothing before it. So I started with index 2 and then checked to make sure it was double the thing before it. Then I did index 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to the end. For this one, I would start with index 2, see if it's double. It is. Then check with index 3. Is it double? Yes. Index 4. Yes. Index 5. This one, 15, is not double 8. So I can stop right here. I know that this is not a doubling list, so I could just report false. This is not a doubling list right here. So now we're going to create the block to be able to tell if this is a doubling list. So it's going to be a predicate because it only reports true or false. I'm going to call it is doubling. It's going to take a list of numbers as its input. Notice I used a plural because it's multiple numbers. It's going to be a list. So click the little arrow, choose the list, and say OK. Because we'll be processing all the things in a list, we are going to use a loop, and we're going to create some script variables that are just for this custom block. I'm going to have a script variable for the index so that I can go through all of the positions in the list. I'm going to set index to be equal to 2, because as we saw in the example, you don't have to check to see if the first number is twice as big as the one before it, because there's nothing before the first. So I'll start with index being equal to 2. I also want to keep track of the previous number. So I'm going to set a variable called previous number, and it's going to start out as just the first item in the list. I'm going to set previous number to be the first item in the list. That way when I start out checking the second thing, the number that comes before it, the previous number, will be the first item in the list. So I will set the previous one to be item 1 of the list. The list in this case is the numbers input. And now I'm ready to start a loop. So I'm going to repeat. I'm not going to repeat as many times as the length of the list, because since I'm starting on index number 2, I only have to repeat the length of the list minus 1. So I'm going to get a subtraction operator. I'm going to pull that in here. There's going to be a minus 1. I'm going to get the length of the list block. So I'm going to use the length of the input list minus 1. And that's how many times I want to repeat this. So two things could happen. I could check to see if this number is twice as big as the one before. And if it is, then I want to keep checking to see if it continues doubling. And if it's not, then I will just report false and be done. So I'm going to have an if-else block in here. So I'm going to say check to see if the item that I'm currently on is equal to the twice as, well, if it's twice as big as the thing before it. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to use a multiplication, and I'm going to do 2 times the previous number. So if 2 times the previous number is equal to the current number, so let's get the current item in the list. And how do we get the current item in the list? That's what we're using the index for. Remember, index is starting out as 2. So it's first going to be, is item 2 equal to double the previous number? And remember, the previous number starts out as the first item in the list. So I'm going to change this to say index, so item index. If it is, then that means I want to keep going on. I want to check the next number to see if it's twice as big as the one before it. But before I move on to the next number, I need to set the previous number, because now once you move on to the third item in the list, the one that comes before it is the second item in the list. So previous number starts out as the first item in the list, and I need to keep updating it every time. So the first thing I'll do is set previous number to be equal to the current item in the list. Now that probably doesn't make sense right now. You're thinking, well, how is previous number the same as the current item? Right now it's not, but I'm setting up for the next repetition through this loop, so that as soon as I repeat, I also am going to now change the index. So now I'm going to change index by 1. So before I change the index, I made sure to get this item out of the list and set it equal to the previous number. So the first time I do this, I would choose item 2 of the list and set it to previous number, and then I would increase index for number 3, so that the next time I come through, I'd be looking at item 3 and checking if it's equal to double the previous number. And remember, I just saved the previous number as item 2. Another way people do this is, instead of having a special variable for previous number, they'll just use a second item block. So you could also just create a second item block, but instead of using index, you would just use one right before the index. So if you don't want to have a previous number variable, you can just do this to get the number that comes before. I'll leave it for now, since I already created that variable. And it helps you to understand what's happening. 2 times the previous number, it's easier to read. Now what if the 2 times the previous number was not equal to the current item that you're looking at, item number 2 of the list, or on the next repetition, item 3 of the list, or item 4? Well, if it's not equal, then you know that this is not a doubling list. So you can just go ahead and report false right here. Now you might wonder, is it going to continue doing the repetitions? And the answer is no. Whenever you have a reporter, as soon as you report something, the whole script, this whole block ends. So as soon as I report false, it's not going to keep doing the loops. It's not going to do anything else. It's just going to report false, and you're not going to have to worry about continuing to look. Now what happens if you get all the way through all of the list and you never said false? Well, that must mean that every time it was doubling. So if you get all the way through the loop and then you're here at the end, you can report true, because that means that it must have been doubling the whole time. So let's test it on our list that we have right here. So this is a list that should be doubling. So if I click, it should say true, and it does. And then we have another list that is not doubling, because 8 to 15 is not doubling. Click on this and it says false.